reading some ghost stories from the subreddit r/ghost stories, just to get us in a lovely spooky mood today. Also, happy Halloween. May your day be filled with frightful tricks and sweet treats. Well, this story is from an account that was deleted, but the title says, "Bought my first house and found out it was haunted." I bought my first house in 2003 and was over the moon. Shortly after moving in, two of my neighbors began joking with me about the ghost in my house. Well, I thought they were joking, so I just played along, pretending I had seen one and that it was no big deal. Well, as time went on that summer, I met more and more of my neighbors, and they all brought up the same topic. Finally, an elderly woman on the block who was quite kind and friendly told me a story after I asked her. I knew she wasn't going to screw with my head, which is why I asked her in the first place. Turned out, the previous owner purchased the home and never lived there because she said it was haunted. Sounds in the night of footsteps and sobbing and glimpses of a man sitting in the kitchen covered in blood. One of my neighbors helped with the renovations of the house and said that he was putting up drywall when he felt something lift up his dreadlocks. Though I've had paranormal experiences before, it had been years, and by then I had just chalked it up to night terrors. One day, I went to a small neighborhood video store to rent a movie. I had to fill out a form with my demographic data, and then my credit card info. The owner of the store looked at the form and said, "Oh my God, you live in that house?" I asked her what she meant by that, and she explained that her former employee had committed suicide in my house. She came to the house as soon as she'd heard, but the house had been taped off by police as a potential crime scene. She told me that he had just moved into the house with his partner and called his mom because he wanted to invite her over to meet his partner and come out to her. This was in the early 90s, when being gay was a big deal. His mother already knew he was gay because he bought a house with a man and disowned him right over the phone. That same week, he received a letter from an HIV testing center stating he had been tested positive for HIV, and this was when HIV was a death sentence. He then sat at the kitchen table, ate a bowl of cereal, and shot himself in the head with a revolver. Since then, she has had multiple paranormal experiences in the store, with videos flying off shelves and even levitating off said shelves. The most I have experienced is sounds at night, sounds of Cheerios being poured into a bowl. I don't eat cereal. And sounds of sobbing in the kitchen. I often awake to both. I remember my grandmother saying, "When the dead come to you, they want something. Perform an act of charity in their name and pray for them." So I did. I sat down at the kitchen table one night and lit a candle and told him that each night I would recite a novena prayer for him before a lit candle. On the 9th night of the first novena to St. Anthony, patron saint of lost souls, I heard uncontrollable sobbing. I felt a strong presence of grief and despair, and the sound of hyperventilating breathing, as though someone could not catch their breath. I sat in the presence of this, knowing it was not malignant, but rather a connection of intimacy and compassion of which he was in need. For 45 days, I said a novena prayer before I lit candle for his soul and had a mass set in his name. A few times I had awakened to his presence standing over my bed, but I knew it was not a malignant presence. This still happens to me from time to time, but less and less frequently. I feel so bad for him. I hope he finds peace, wherever he may be, whether he's in the house still. Alright, so this next Reddit post is from a user called ChristianIsLost72. I hope you all enjoy the next story on r/ghost stories. And like I said, from a user called ChristianIsLost72. Title of this post is The White Witch. In the early 80s, I lived in Okinawa, Japan. My dad thought that seeing the world would be an adventure that would help my brother and I become better men, and I have to say, I think he was right. Being in the military showed me cultures many would never get to experience, and I am thankful for every experience that life gave to me, even the scary ones. While we lived in Japan, my father wanted us to have a fully immersive experience, so he chose to move us into a small Japanese neighborhood off base. We lived in a little house at the top of an enormous hill in a cul-de-sac that overlooked, I kid you not, part of a huge zoo, and on one side, a fairly large cemetery. Our particular house was set far above the monkey habitats about a mile downhill. Between us and those habitats was nothing but thick Indiana Jones-style jungle. Jungle the neighborhood kids and I would tromp through endlessly, ignoring the local warnings about poisonous snakes and ancient untripped mines from World War II. We were the only American family living in that cul-de-sac, completely surrounded by Japanese families, and it was amazing. The kids loved us, and although we couldn't communicate through language very well, we understood each other perfectly. Well, most of the time. Opposite us was an older couple with a lush garden surrounding their property. The older woman wanted us to call her Mama-san, and she had us helping her garden whenever she could coax us over with green tea and chocolate banana cookies. We loved her. She was so welcoming and generous, as was everyone else, actually. We lived in a wonderful neighborhood. The only drawback to Mama-san's home, however, was that she directly overlooked the cemetery. And that cemetery was unlike any cemetery I had ever seen before. Because Okinawa is an island, burials don't happen very often. Instead, above-ground crypts are built, many of them built into the sides of the hills that make up the land. The crypts are large, made of huge arcs of polished stone sewed over a large square of that stone, which has a square insert cut into the middle of it for the coffin to be placed inside. Once the square is inset with another piece of polished stone just inside, leaving a kind of shelf on the outside so offerings could be made to lost loved ones. Yen, food, flowers, incense, or some of the offerings given. Below Mama-san's house was a valley that swooped back up into another hill opposite her home. That valley and both hills were covered with these crypts, and spider webbing up and down through the crypts were various stone step pathways that were old and badly maintained. It was quite a sight. One evening, Mama-san asked me to come visit her with her alone. She had something to show me, but it was only for me as the older brother. Intrigued and a bit proud, I agreed. She took me to the back of her garden and sat me on a thick wooden bench that was carved with scenes of fishermen and men with swords, and told me she had a story to tell. Mama-san then disappeared for a few minutes and soon returned with a tray that held hot green tea and sweet rice cakes. Sitting next to me, she smiled and commented on the colors of the evening sky as the sun began to lower. Mama-san said she had seen me, my brother, and some other kids daring each other to follow a stairway path down into the cemetery. You have to understand, the path from our little home area down to the cemetery consisted of hundreds of steps, many broken or cracking, in and out of bushes, and at a steep incline. It would be dangerous for anyone, but the real test was seeing how long we could take walking through the crypts at night. Mama-san wanted to explain why that was a bad idea. Many years ago, during the war, Americans were thought to be devils, monsters that would murder innocent citizens for no reason other than to kill. That fear was the product of wartime propaganda used to encourage young men to military service and farmers to fight alongside them. But many didn't. Many ran, and with nowhere to go, nowhere to hide, hundreds of Japanese citizens hurled themselves off a cliffside rather than face torture at the hands of their perceived enemy. I was terrified at hearing this. I had no idea this had happened. I was mortified and hit with such sadness. I started to cry. The sun was setting, and the sky went from pink and blue to deep orange and red. Mama-san reached out and held my hand, telling me not to worry. This was the past, and the past is something we must always remember, so we never go back. She went on with her story. One young woman had followed through with this sacrifice with her 2 children, but she survived the fall. She was in a coma for months. When she did regain consciousness, she was horrified to realize she was not with her children. They had been buried somewhere in that cemetery below, in an unmarked crypt that held many others. The woman would spend days and nights searching the cemetery, crying in pain, the torment of her loss unbearable, until the day she threw herself into the ocean to hopefully be reunited with her lost family. But they say she never found her children. Her act of suicide doomed her to purgatory. She would remain tortured for eternity. The sun had disappeared. The cemetery drowned in inky blackness. The main path dotted with dim, broken lights, feebly illuminating small areas. Mama-san continued. She still wanders the cemetery, she said, looking for her kids. You could hear her crying, and then she pointed down. I didn't want to, but I did. I looked. In the back of the cemetery, in the darkness, there was a white figure, at first a bright white shimmer, moving slowly, kind of shaking. It moved from side to side, like it was moving along among the crypts, and you could actually hear the crying. Softly at first, but then low moans and whimpers of pain as it got closer. I was terrified. I wanted to run, but Mama-san held my hand and whispered that she wouldn't come up here. We were too far. but that is why we shouldn't go down there after dark. She said many people don't know her story and call her the White Witch, which angers her. It's best to stay away. It's best to pray for her. Mama-san says that she comes out to see her often, hoping one day she will find her salvation. Needless to say, I never went down to that cemetery. Not once. And I've never sat back there with Mama-san again either. That was enough for me. I did, however, visit Suicide Hill. It's called Peace Prayer Park now, out of respect. I cried the whole time we were there. I prayed for all the souls and for forgiveness. So many Japanese citizens spoke to us, welcoming us, telling us stories, sharing with us. I didn't feel worthy, and my love for the country and its people was overwhelming. I'll never forget my time there. I'd like to go back, to see if she's still there, wandering the graves, looking for her children. So, this is a long one, according to the title, by a user called wolf_dream. And the title is My Trip to the Slaughter Yard, a story my mom wouldn't tell me until my 30s. And like I said, this is going to be a long one, so sit back, grab a snack, and remember to stay hydrated. So let me start out by saying I enjoy writing, so this will be long. It's nonfiction though, but will hopefully be an interesting read. I also admit that I have absolutely no memory of this experience. I was a little over 2 years old and just starting to walk on my own when this event took place. My mom only told me this story around 3 years ago when I was 32 and about to get married. My mother was raised in a very tiny fundamentalist Christian community and had no belief in the paranormal. She believed that our souls sleep until Judgment Day or something like this. Ergo, there are no ghosts or spirits to haunt houses. Even over 30 years later, she still sounded terrified as she told me this. This woman, who always talks way too loud, was literally whispering by the end of it, and she was as white as a sheet. I believed her completely and still do. My mom never talks about stuff like this. I'm just glad I can't remember it too. In 1988, my parents had their second child. This was my brother, Victor, alias. We were very crowded in our rented flat with 2 babies. My parents decided to move to a rambling 2-story farmhouse on a 7-acre plot in southern Ohio for more room for the family. It was way out in the sticks and took almost an hour to get to town from there. My mom said the first time I saw the house, I freaked out. I was crying and saying things like, "Don't like mean house, ugly house, don't like, scary house, mama, don't like." My mom says this behavior was very out of character for me, but I stopped complaining about the house after a few weeks, so she chalked it up to the stress of the move. Now, this house was ramshackle as fuck and in the middle of nowhere. The kitchen was to the far rear of the house, and until recently, before we moved in, still had a working ancient wood-burning cooking stove against the back wall. This had caught the back wall on fire a couple months before we moved in, and caused a lot of damage. A lot of this damage wasn't fixed, so my young, broke parents got a very cheap rent agreement Gotta love the 80s. On the second floor, directly above the kitchen, was a locked room. The landlord claimed it had heavy fire damage, but her son, who had done the repairs, claimed the only fire damage left was in the kitchen, since it had been the worst and was beyond his skill level to fix. Either way, the landlord was adamant that the room was off limits, and my parents always respected that. I would have looked 100% lol. I know all this because I heard stories about the crappy farmhouse with the creepy door my whole life, and there were pictures of us in and around the farmhouse. The locked door was right next to the upstairs landing, so there was no avoiding it, and both my parents have told me it gave them the creeps. A few months after we moved in, my mother and I were in the yard with our pit Doberman mix, Boss. She was hanging laundry, and I was rolling around with the dog. She said that just as she noticed that everything was way too silent, Boss started going absolutely apeshit from surprisingly far away, about 500 yards from the house on the left. There was a small duck pond. Boss was in between the two, running towards my mom, then turning and running back towards the pond, barking frantically the whole time. My mom saw something thrashing around in the middle of the pond. She took off towards the water full speed. Boss beat her there and drug me out of the water himself. Thank you, Pupper. Love you. Although my mom was confused how I got so far, so fast, and how I got into the center of the pond, since it was over my head and I couldn't swim. So she figured she underestimated me and brought in the baby gates and playpens. I was to be contained from now on. A few weeks later, she was cooking downstairs. Boss was outside, Victor asleep in his crib, and I was in my playpen in my room upstairs. I also had a gate on my door and one at the top of the stairs. The stairs ran up from the side of the kitchen, so my mom said she could listen for us crying or fussing while cooking. My mom said no longer than 15 minutes after the last time she looked in on us kids, Boss starts going crazy again in the yard. She runs up to check on us. Victor is still sleeping. Every baby gate is still shut and locked. But I am not in my room. A frenzied search reveals I'm not in the house at all. A sudden image of Boss saving me from drowning causes my mom to rush outside to see what he's trying to tell her this time. She said he was running circles in the yard, barking uncontrollably. When she got outside, he took off towards the right, away from the pond. He would run ahead, turn around, and bark at my mother, wait for her to catch up a little before racing off again. He ended up leading her almost a mile and a half out onto the dirt road that separated our property from our neighbors. He led her to a thick stand of trees on our neighbor's side of the rocky drive. She said what hit her first was the foul stench of advanced decay. She plowed into the trees with her heart in her throat and her stomach full of ice. She said she noticed many piles of corrugated tin, tarts, tires, and other debris. The miasma was emanating most strongly from these junkyard cairns. Peeking under a sheet of tin, she discovered the extremely decomposed corpse of a butchered cow. As she headed deeper into the thicket, where the tree cover was denser, she said less care was taken to cover the remains. Grisly pieces of bones and rotted chunks of bovine littered the area. Apparently, our neighbor, in an effort to cheat his taxes, had been illegally slaughtering cattle and hiding the remains in at least one of the few thick stands of trees around. She found me in the dead center of this thicket, just standing there, looking around like I was confused, surrounded by carnage. She said I didn't seem scared or anything, just standing. She rushed over to me, and after ascertaining that I wasn't injured, began questioning me on why I was here, how I got there, etc. Keep in mind that although my mother said I started speaking very young, I still didn't have much of a vocabulary. She said I told her, with a serious look only small children can give, that the children brought me here. Shotting her pants at the thought that anyone, even children, could walk right past her door, through the kitchen, and get me from upstairs, and walk right back past her on the way down the stairs and out with me. She demanded to know what children and where the hell they are now. I looked at her dead serious and told her the ones that live with us in the room at the top of the stairs, and that I didn't see them anymore. After a moment of stunned silence, she started asking all kinds of questions about these children. However, she told me that I refused to say anything else. She said as long as she questioned me about it, what happened, as long as she questioned me about what happened, I would just stand there staring at her with a serious expression and my mouth closed. She said the same pattern held true every other time she brought it up to me, so she was always left wondering and immediately began hounding my dad about moving closer to town. While the incident with me getting to the pond was highly unlikely, it was at least remotely possible. My mother is adamant that me being in the hidden slaughter yard that day was flat impossible. She says there's no way I could have even known I was out there. It was out there, much less have the ability to open and relock the baby gates, get downstairs, past her, and I'm almost 2 miles down the road and in this place in under 15 minutes. I was only 2, and as slow as clumsy as most toddlers. As I said, she's still shaken by it after 30 years. Personally, I have no idea what happened that day. I've thought about hypnosis, but haven't yet decided. I really want to remember. Maybe it's better to let it be a mystery. Because whatever the fuck those things were, I really don't think they were children. So, this Reddit story is from a user called PKP434, titled My Daughter's Imaginary Friend. In 2013, my wife and I divorced, and we both moved into separate homes. The divorce went well, and we are still good friends to this day, partly because we have a daughter together. We agreed to split custody over our daughter, and I rented an old house in a historic district in the city where we live. It was a very pretty home, built in 1935, but kept very well. I would have my daughter 2 weeks at a time, and she had a bedroom in the back of the house. She was 3 years old at the time, and I kept noticing her talking to her friend. One day, I found her in a little closet talking to someone. I remember her saying she was talking to another little girl named Betty. I have no idea where she heard the name Betty, as she was only 3 years old, but I just chalked it all up to a child's vivid imagination. Keep in mind, I am a single dad to a little girl. I really have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to dressing, hair, or just little girl stuff in general. Her mother is good at that stuff, but not me. I put my daughter to bed one night after her bath. I remember brushing her hair that night, but that was all I did. The very next morning, her mom came to pick her up from my house, and my daughter was just waking up. Her mom went back to her bedroom to find my daughter's hair was fixed in 2 perfect French braids. Her mom was real proud of me at first that I had done her hair so cute, but I told her I didn't and couldn't do that. I can't even braid her hair, much less do perfect French braids. We asked our daughter how her hair got fixed, and she told us that Betty had done it during the night. I broke the contract on the rental agreement and moved out within the next month. Alright, so this next story is going to be the last story I read for the day. But I hope it spooks you. This next story is from a user called Film Gorilla, as in guerrilla warfare, not the animal. And the title of this is A Terrifying Encounter While in Iraq. I was a sergeant in the U.S. Army and ETSing, getting out from the military when President Bush ordered more troops into Iraq in 2003. I had just returned home to Austin, Texas, when I was summoned into my local National Guard unit at Camp Mabry and told that I was being recalled to the Army. But the unit was already tasked out to deploy to Iraq. I was not a part of their unit yet, so the commander offered to give me a waiver to deploy with a government contractor, Halliburton, in Houston. I knew that I would make more money as a contractor, so I took the offer. Not long after arriving in Kuwait at Camp Doha, I began working with the operations team overseeing logistics affairs. We would oversee the daily convoy supply between Kuwait and Baghdad, a route riddled with IED incidents, small arms skirmishes, and almost constant breakdowns of Army and civilian vehicles. Because I was a SAW gunner in the 1st Infantry Division while in active duty, and was technically still in the Guard, I was often in the convoys, manning a mounted weapon that accompanied the mostly civilian convoys. During these runs, we had a few strange encounters in the area south of Baghdad, known then as Camp Babylon. Occupied by French troops, but then designated as an archaeological site for obvious reasons, Camp Babylon was set up in the area that was said to originally be inhabited by the famous Tower of Babel. Indeed, there were ruins there that did look like a massive structure once stood in that spot. I had 2 strange incidents happen to me while passing through there. The first incident seems a bit benign, but sets the mood for the second. We were passing through Camp Babylon in the afternoon one day when our convoy took small arms fire. The SOP at the time, standard operating procedure, was to stop the convoy and return fire. This was because, in the past, such incidents ended up being a lone gunman attempting to scare the convoy into running into IEDs on the road. Because of this, the standard operating procedure changed to stop the convoy, dismount, and return fire. While engineers looked for explosive devices on the road, we scanned the horizon for enemies. Nothing. They most likely fled immediately. However, the ruins around Camp Babylon were alive with shadow figures that seemed to move about the area. Several times we would spot the figures, but they would immediately disappear. A contractor, lying beside me with his weapon, commented, "How odd that we are in the shadow of Babel and fighting the supernatural." I didn't respond, but knew that he was a 32nd degree Mason who was really into the arcane aspects of Babylon, etc. I didn't feel at the time that much was supernatural, but certainly did see the shadowy and bizarrely small figures dart about the structures. Once the road was deemed clear, we continued on to Baghdad. The second incident occurred about a month later. At this point, the weather in southern Iraq and Kuwait had turned quite cold at night. During this encounter, we had just completed the supply run to Baghdad and were returning back to Camp Doha in Kuwait when a vehicle in our convoy broke down. Once again, we found ourselves right at Camp Babylon. While the army mechanics took a look at the vehicle, and the rest of us took up fighting positions around the area, strange things began to occur. It started with a strange light bobbing in the desert. Thinking it was a person with a flashlight, we used NVGs, night vision goggles, to watch. It was simply a glowing ball of light moving towards a set of ruins. After initial contact with the light, a few of us had moved forward away from the convoy to see what the source was. After seeing it was self-contained and not a person, we were a bit alarmed. Then we heard a sound that I will never forget. A long wailing began from one of the ruined structures / foundations not far away. It sounded like a woman in agony, mixed with loneliness. On and on the sounds went, while we huddled in the cold and dark, wondering what the hell we were listening to. With our NVGs equipped, we used our flashlights to spotlight the ruins. If you've ever done this, you will know that a normal flashlight with night vision goggles looks like a massive beam of light. We scoured the area, but no source of the wails or the ball of light were seen. About this time, we were told via radio that the vehicle was repaired and ready to roll, so we decided to return to the convoy. I was slinging my saw over my shoulder when I noticed my contractor partner was staring at the ruins in horror. He was frozen. I shook him and he snapped out of his stupor, quickly leaving the area with the rest of us. Once we were back at the camp, and it was pleasantly daylight the following morning, several of us were chatting about the encounter at Camp Babylon before our daily operations briefing. It was then that I remembered the terrified expression on the face of the contractor. So I asked him about it. He was still obviously traumatized by the event, but managed to explain that as we were leaving our position on the sandy hill, he saw a tall, black figure standing beside the ruins. He was watching us as we were looking for him, her, it. He said that he felt an instant wave of despair hit him and thought he was going to die. He didn't remember leaving the area. His next memory was in the Humvee headed back to Kuwait. I now write nonfiction books about haunted places for Lelwyn Publishing and have visited hundreds of reputedly haunted spots. But I'll never forget the wailing figure at the ruins of Babel. It's also worth noting that when I related this story to some of our Pakistani employees at Camp Doha and Camp Arifjan, they were also quite horrified. One of them, a translator we called Artie, said that we had encountered a jinn, or a damned spirit, and that we were lucky to be able to tell the tale. I agree. So, this last story is from a user called MJ Farmer 147. The title of this one is I Saw My Grandfather at His Own Funeral, held his hand, spoke with him, and took a walk together one last time. My grandfather died in 1995 due to emphysema and other health concerns. He was in his early 60s and left us prematurely, as he had many people who loved and depended on him, including many young grandchildren. I was only 4 years old, almost 5 at the time when he passed, and I don't remember much from this darker time in my life, but I remember his funeral extremely vividly. I was in a funeral home that has multiple parlors and many hallways throughout the building. I remember being outside of his parlor and seeing him across the room. We locked eyes. I walked over to him. After all, he was my grandpa, and I did not realize at the time that he had passed on. We began our usual, as we were 2 peas in a pod and had a special relationship. And we held hands and walked through the halls. Much of the conversation I do not recall, but I do remember showing him the lounge area, as that was my favorite place to be, what with all the snacks and vending machines. As we approached the area that we had met at, we stopped, and he said to me, "Michael, I have to go now." He had vanished, literally leaving my hand empty in the air. I can still see my empty hand and remember the shock and confusion. The part that helps me to think this was an authentic experience, and this is something my grandmother, aunt, and mother remember well and were concerned for years about. As I approach the open casket, my mother picks me up. I see my Grandpa Leroy there in his piece, and I begin, confused, to relentlessly ask why Grandpa was in a casket and what is wrong with him. My mother told me, crying, and I remember this clearly, "Michael, honey, he's dead. He's gone and is not coming back." I was in disbelief, arguing, "No, no, no, I just saw him. He's outside." After this, I remember us all crying together, but that is all. I never spoke about it until I was about 12 or 13 years old. I was at my grandmother's, and her health was wavering at the time. I'd been thinking about it a lot with her being in that state and having memories of my experience, and I finally broke down and told them what I had remembered. Again, we cried, and they didn't believe I could remember that, or that I had held on to it through all these years of childhood. They, in a way, directly corroborate my experience for me, at least solidifying it in my head as a final goodbye from one of my favorite human beings, as they remember the scene at the casket. They were always too afraid to ask me about it, maybe to protect me from emotional anguish. My grandmother, for the remaining year or so she was with us, would ask me to tell her the story any time I would visit her. She also claims to have woken up one day feeling my grandfather lying next to her. She said she could feel it was him, as if she went to bed next to him and woke up together. She never told anyone that until I had shared my story. I hope anyone reading this enjoyed the story. It's one I will never forget. I want to thank you so much for being here with me. I hope you got a little shiver up your spine, just like I did. May your Halloween be spooky. And as always, hydrate before you dehydrate. I know it's short, but it was sweet, wasn't it? And isn't that the best treat you can get on Halloween? Anyways, stay safe, much love, and I'll see you around.